Good afternoon, at least for those of you who are in Japan. This is Takeo Hoshi, director of the Tokyo College and moderator for today's webinar. Today's webinar is in English, but it comes with a simultaneous translation into Japanese. So if you want to listen to this webinar in Japanese, go to your Zoom webinar app and turn on the interpretation, turn on the simultaneous translation, so that you can hear Japanese. Many of you have attended Tokyo College webinar before, so you probably know what Tokyo College is. But just in case, for those of you who are attending this for the first time, attending the Tokyo College event for the first time, let me start with a few words on Tokyo College. Tokyo College was created within the University of Tokyo in February of 2019, so it's 5 years ago, and with the purpose of generating new knowledge to contribute to the creation of an inclusive society and sparking deeper public engagement. So that's our purpose. And under the slogan of shaping a shared future together, we have been inviting distinguished scholars and experts from all over the world and having them give webinars like this one. And our invited speakers are not only distinguished researchers and experts, but also open to interdisciplinary discussion and serious about public engagement that we are aiming for. So today's speaker is a good example of such a distinguished expert. Dr. Luiz Awazu PEREIRA da Silva is a distinguished economist whose career spans both academia and public policy area. Dr. PEREIRA da Silva has doctorate in economics from Sorbonne, Paris, and has served in many important positions in the public sector of Brazil, which is his native country. He was a deputy finance minister for international affairs from 2004 to 2006, and then deputy governor of the Central Bank of Brazil from 2010 to 2015. He also experienced management positions in international financial institutions such as the World Bank, and he was deputy general manager of the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, from 2015 until recently. His connection to Japan goes back very far, as some of you may be able to guess from one of his last names, Awazu. It's a Japanese name. And he also worked in Tokyo for Japan Bank for International Corporation, or JBIC, as the director of the country risk department. And while doing all of these public policy area, he also published academic papers and books on international economics and finance. Today's talk is titled Central Banking in the 21st Century. So he will be discussing the future of central banking, and I think he's an ideal person to do this, given his wide experience and deep knowledge in this area. We also have an excellent commentator as well. Professor Kosuke Aoki is professor at School of Economics here at the University of Tokyo, and a colleague of mine. He's a world-leading expert on macroeconomics and monetary policy. He has numerous academic publications in leading economics journals. And also, he has actively participated in the policy discussion on central banks and the monetary policy issues, in particular about Japan. So I really look forward to Professor Aoki's comment, as well as Dr. PEREIRA da Silva's lecture. So now I ask Dr. PEREIRA da Silva to talk for about 40 to 45 minutes, and that will be followed by Professor Aoki's comment for about 10 to 15 minutes. And for the audience of the webinar, you can write in your questions using the Q&A function of the Zoom. And you can do this during the talk or after the talk. I will be watching Q&A and select some of them to share after the talk and the comment. So let's get started. Dr. Awazu PEREIRA da Silva, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Hoshi. Thank you very much, Professor Aoki, for accepting to be with us. Thank you, everyone, and good afternoon for attending this webinar. I prepared for you, and I will be sharing with you some slides to introduce this conversation. So, yes, the talk is about central banking in the 21st century, the future, in the age of artificial intelligence, climate change, inequality. Now, you can ask, why central banks? Well, central banks, in popular imagination, is always about some big bank robbery or rescue, lender of last resort against big recessions, a sort of helicopter money printing, control of the financial system, masters of the universe. Now, actually, central banks are an independent, by law, usually, technical authority or institution that implements one of the components of what is called stabilization policy, the monetary component. The other is fiscal policy that is conducted by governance. And central banks use interest rate to stimulate or cool economic activity, employment, and of course, hence inflation. And it has by law accountability to society. Now, the central bank usually has a mandate to ensure low and stable inflation, and this is price stability, and also reducing the risks of financial crisis. This is financial stability component of their mandates. And in most developed countries, so sorry for that. So now you see it. So just briefly, the title of the talk is about central banking in the age of artificial intelligence, climate change and inequality, the 21st century. And the issue is, okay, why central banks? The popular image of central banks is associated with big events, big crises, helicopter money. And actually, I was saying central banks are technically an independent by law authority institution that implements one component of stabilization policy, which is monetary policy, and the other being fiscal policy conducted by governments. For that, it uses interest rate to stimulate or to cool activity, employment, and of course, hence inflation. And the usual mandate of central banks is to ensure low and stable inflation, price stability, and reduce the risk of financial crisis, financial stability. And usually in most developed countries, central bank sets a target for inflation at 2%. Now, why inflation is so important when it is low and stable? Well, we know the benefits of low and stable inflation as something that helps to predict behavior of firms and consumers. It helps to provide more investment, to smooth consumption. It preserves savings. It lowers costs for exporters. It provides a stable environment that reduces the likelihood of cycles of booms and busts. Now, since we are in Japan, we also know very well that there is a risk for having too low an inflation because it can be associated with excessive personal savings, very low interest rates, an ineffectiveness of monetary policy. If you lower interest rates too much, it doesn't seem to stimulate enough the economy. And then you have a spiral of declining prices, lower wages, lower consumption, lower profits, lower investments, high real debts, and possibly defaults and banking crisis with stagnations and recession. So we want to achieve as a central bank is a sort of Goldilocks type of situation. The economy is neither too hot or neither too cold. And I will talk about this, but also what I see as the future of the activities of central bank in this century, with 6 big challenges that I see. Of course, I think everybody knows, perhaps not as much in Japan, but elsewhere in the world, the re-emergence of inflation. Then the dealing with the perennial problems of central bank, which is irrational exuberance in financial sectors, bubbles. Then the third is climate change. I think it's in everybody's minds. How do central banks cope with that? A fourth topic is the effect of inequality on the effectiveness of monetary policy. The fifth is this whole changes that we are seeing in terms of digital financial innovation and artificial intelligence. And finally, I will conclude saying, okay, what does it mean for central banks' mandates and accountability? So starting with the challenge number 1, the re-emergence of inflation in the short and medium term. Now, inflation, as you know, is the percentage increase of a general price index on a year-over-year basis. You can see in this graph that it has been quite a declining trend that has been achieved after the oil shocks of the 70s and 80s. So central banks were successful in lowering and stabilizing inflation. It was called the Great Moderation. And you can see in the graph that this is valid for both emerging markets, the red line, and also advanced economies, the blue lines. And after attempts to control inflation via control of the money supply, most central banks adopted a way of doing things, a monetary framework that is called inflation targeting. What is this? This is a system where the central bank sets an interest rate, cost of money, a policy level that ensures the convergence of activity, employment, compatible with a pre-announced level of inflation, 2% in general, which anchors the future expectations of inflation and creates this equilibrium between activity, employment, and also stability of prices and of the financial sector. Now, this was very good, and as you can remember from the previous slide, this went very well until the middle of 2021. And what happened is, if you look at the more close problem, is that after a period of great moderation, very low inflation, you had a sudden emergence of inflation in the middle of 2021. And it was a bit of a surprise for central banks. Of course, we know that there was a lot of stimulus provided during the great financial crisis, COVID-19. There was war-related food and energy price increases, as you can see in the graph in red and yellow, and also some supply bottlenecks. Now, other factors also explain this outburst of inflation. The wages in very tight labor market service sectors, and also there was a bit of an underestimation of this surge in inflation. And inflation fell after central bank action, but remained resilient in terms of being above the convergence to a 2% target within a decent time frame of 1 to 2 years. It turned out to be more difficult than expected. This is called the last mile problem for central banks. Now, at the beginning, central banks actually thought that the issue was a bit transitory, that these supply shocks, war, food, energy, explained the inflation and were going to fade. and therefore they started hiking interest rates only a little bit later, central banks in advanced economy. That was not the case in emerging market economies, central banks, which, as you can see in the graph on the left, these are the policy rate changes of central banks in advanced economies and in emerging markets. EMEs started rising much earlier than the advanced economy. Nevertheless, inflation, of course, as I mentioned, fell, but remain resilient. So the question in the short term is whether is it enough, the tightening of monetary policy that was done so far, whether we will have a soft or a hard landing, whether you need central banks to do more to reduce inflation, including perhaps even setting the economy into a recession. So the debate in the short term about inflation is whether central banks have done enough and whether they can start cutting interest rates. So therefore, the assessment of the situation and the communication of how central banks see the short-term inflation becomes a very challenging exercise for market expectations and financial markets. And the numbers so far indicate, again, this issue of resilience. Now, the short term is difficult, but the medium long term is perhaps even more complicated because of some cost push factors and structural changes that might affect as repeated shocks all advanced economies. For example, the fact that you are in a situation where you have a diminution of the disinflationary effect of China, India, Russia in the global economy, the large number of new workers that came into the workforce of the global economy. You know that you have also increased the cost due to reshaping of global trade due to geopolitical tensions and rise in protectionism. If you change the transportation routes, if you change the location of some of your productions in places where you will have higher wages, well, you will certainly face higher production costs. And in addition, you have also the change in the behavior of some service sectors in terms of labor markets in those particular sectors. People are, of course, demanding higher wages. They don't want necessarily after the COVID to be working in the same conditions that they worked 5 or 6 years ago. They want a bit more remuneration. Finally, you have the cost of greening our economies in terms of the need for technological investments and higher technologies, greener technologies that would certainly have an impact in terms of the costs for us of doing what we do. Illustrations of these changes, well, this is the sort of flattening or stabilization of globalizations in terms of the size of exports to GDP or the size of world trade to GDP, two graphs that show that in the last 10 years, the trend, the globalization trend, the benefits of globalization, of lower wages, lower costs is fading. Also, the fact that this illustration of two things, this slide illustrates the fact that you have tighter, maybe, labor markets. The measure of it on the left is the number of job openings vis-a-vis unemployment. People sometimes are not necessarily willing to work under the same conditions as before COVID. It means that you have more job openings than people willing to work at the current wages. On the right, you have also the growth in wages. This is something that is happening because you have this surge in inflation, and this is for the US, the two graphs, and you have now a more demand for higher wages because of the overshooting of inflation. And here is the illustration of the green premium I was mentioning to you. The fact that if you want today to lower your carbon footprint in transportation, agriculture, manufacturing. This is the graph, the bars on the left. Would be an estimation of the additional costs that you will have to pay to do the same thing today with green technology, clean technology. Now, of course, this means an additional cost. Hopefully, on the right, you see that simultaneously to that, you have the cost of these green technologies that are falling, but perhaps the issue for the medium term is how fast these two things will offset each other, how fast prices of new technologies, green technologies will fall vis-a-vis the current need to shift to a low carbon economy. And finally, it's not only the cost of technologies, the fact that we need to invest more. These two graphs illustrate how much we are currently on the left investing in clean energy. Globally, you are investing between $1 to $2 trillion a year. But on the right, you see an estimate of what would be needed if you really want to achieve a scenario of carbon neutrality by 2050. It's not $1 to $2 trillion per year that you need to invest. You can see the bars. You need to invest 3, perhaps 4, 5 times more every year during several decades to really transform the capital stock that we have into a capital stock, a production process that is carbon neutral. So big problem. In the short term, inflation is still high. You have to converge. In the medium term, you have higher costs that you will have to sort of bear for the transition to net zero. Now, the other problem is a usual financial exuberance that central banks face. Despite the fact that central banks achieved great moderation of prices in the 90s and 2000s, it did not suppress financial crisis. This is a sort of perennial feature of financial markets. You can see on the top left the frequency of financial crisis over a century, and you can see that they are persistent. You can see also that you have volatility in these behaviors of asset prices that we called, or many prominent scholars call, irrational exuberance in financial markets. And what we question in terms of the futures is whether this irrational exuberance couldn't be exacerbated today by new financial technologies, decentralized finance, the widespread use of algorithms, of crypto assets, and artificial intelligence. Is this going to be something that would stabilize the financial sector, reduce crisis, or on the contrary, increase crisis? And it's important to understand that perhaps these new trading technologies, these algorithms, AI, and so on and so forth, they have the potential to increase significantly the volume and the speed of financial market activities, and perhaps even go a step further in the creation of bubbles. You have on the left the illustration of the classical Bob Shiller cyclically adjusted price to earnings ratio, which is a sort of the way in which the price of some assets are way above the reasonable earning that they can provide, which is a sort of a very common sense definition of the creation of a bubble. And we have always the situation of the narrative that, oh, with technology, this time is going to be different. This time is going to be, risks are going to be better evaluated, exuberance will be contained, we will have better supervision, we will have better regulation. Now, one thing that we know is that it changes definitely the concept of bank runs. Bank runs is something very old. You have bank runs in the 19th century. This is the picture of a bank run, very old picture in the 19th century. Bank run is something that is described in the spiral that you have on the right. You have a weakness that is perceived in the bank, you have uncertainty, customers rush to the withdraw their deposit, the confidence is lost, and then you have mass withdrawal. The bank is forced to sell its assets, and there is panic, and therefore then the bank turns insolvent and collapses. Now think of technology and the bottom of the picture on the left with the way in which now today you can immediately access your account with this new ways of accessing through the smartphone or WhatsApp or your computer. Therefore, the speed with which all these events can unfold, and we have recent examples of that, is much more rapid. Now, third challenge, climate change. And here I have to explain why I'm calling this green swans, and why is it that it's important for central banks. Now, for me, a green swan is a new type of systemic, global, and I would say even existential threat. We know that it is a global negative externality. It's a very large shock that affects everything, demand, supply, and we call it a green swan to make a distinction between the usual terminology that the financial crisis created, black swans. Black swan is a very rare event. It's a tale of a distribution event. And for me, a green swan is very different. It's something that is absolutely certain to happen, according to scientists, if there is nothing in terms of policy that is done against it, policies to put in place. Now, why is it that central banks should worry about this? Well, for us, central banks, and this is why we wrote this book at the BIS, climate change impacts the value of financial assets. It impacts, therefore, financial stability, but it also impacts the cost of goods and services, and therefore price stability. And it's not that central banks are going to be alone in addressing this. They need the cooperation of governments, of the private sector, of everybody. But certainly, for their mandates, it affects the way they see things. Illustrations of things that you know, the fact on the top that emissions are still growing. We are emitting today between 35 to 40 gigatons of CO2. And we are, of course, increasing the average temperature above pre-industrial levels, now today about 1.5 degrees Celsius. And it's also increasing the frequency on the bottom of extreme weather events. We know that climate change is something that affects exactly the two mandates of central banks. It has an impact on price stability. You can see a study here that shows that global warming increases the probability of lower yields in agriculture, and therefore higher food prices. And these higher food prices would transmit into higher costs of production. And again, if we do nothing, into 1% higher inflation by 2035, the yellow bar on the top graph, and even 2% higher inflation by 2060. Also, it impacts financial stability. The little bars on the bottom slide represent the losses that are due to natural disasters, and many of them caused by global warming, to banks and to insurance. And these are sizable amounts. We're talking about here trillions of dollars that can be impairing the health of financial sector and insurance companies. Okay, so in a sense, it's not as if central banks are going to be alone in combating climate change, but they certainly have to pay attention to the impact on financial and price stability. The fourth challenge is the effect of inequality of income on monetary policy, which is the domain of central bank. Now, we know that there is a lot of research on inequality, and the fact that inequality has been reduced between countries, let's say in the world as a whole, there is a decline in inequality between rich countries and poor countries. The problem is that within countries, within a specific country, there has been a rise since the beginning of the 80s of inequalities, for example, measures by the share of income of the top decile vis-a-vis the other parts of the population. Now, usually the focus of inequality is structural. What are the reasons is usually a combination of technological change, the fact that you have a natural skill premium for more educated people in any country. And you have also an inequality that is due to the displacement of labor from rich countries to poor countries, which is the process of globalization. Now, what we study at the BIS is something a bit different. It's not the structural dimension of inequality, it's more the cyclical dimension of inequality. Is there something that central banks have to pay attention to, because they are, after all, in the business of stabilization within a business cycle? And we bring new evidence of what we call inequality hysteresis. It's the fact that inequality rises during downturns of the business cycle, and that these increases in inequality tend to be persistent. It makes also recessions deeper. We have, in fact, and unfortunately, less redistributive fiscal policies, you know, the automatic stabilizers, the transfers that are supposed to smooth the income of people during recessions. Well, this is less and less countercyclical since the 80s. And of course, then it raises the burden of stabilization for central banks and monetary policy. And more importantly, I think this is the result of the book, this book that we wrote at the BIS, inequality limits the effectiveness of monetary policy. And here the intuition is relatively simple. If you have a society where you have a lot of, let's say, inequality, rich households tend to save more. And of course, by saving more, their consumption is much less sensitive to the stimulus that monetary policy will provide. If they are rich enough, they are saving, they will sort of respond less to monetary stimulus. And the unequal society in that sense are less responsive to the traditional works of monetary policy by raising or lowering interest rate. In the case of a recession, of course, is lower interest rates. So inequality, of course, is mostly something that governments has to take care about, and fiscal policy in particular. But the point we make here is that since there is this cyclical component of inequality that we study, and this hysteresis, perhaps central bank need also to take this dimension into the way they model the transmission of monetary policy, particularly paying attention to heterogeneity of distribution of income in society. Now, this is let me try to explain to you an illustration of that without complicating too much the picture. This is an econometric exercise that was done with a set of countries during, let's say, the last 20 years. And we simulate, again, a monetary policy stimulation, a cutting of interest rates. And we provide the results of this stimulation. These are the colored dots in the graphs below, illustrating how much consumption growth in each year year T plus 1, year T plus 2, is provided by this monetary stimulus, a sort of a multiplier, a monetary multiplier effect. And as I said, the expectation is that if you stimulate the activity by lower interest rates, you should trigger more consumption, right? Now, what we test is there a difference between equal countries and more unequal countries? And the more unequal countries are the results with dark brown dots. And the lighter dots, the pink dots, are the results of the stimulation by monetary policy of more equal countries. You can see in the little graphs on the bottom that the more equal countries, the pink dots, have a higher response to the same monetary stimulus than the less equal countries, the brown dots. It's higher by 1 to 2 percentage points in year T, T plus 1, and T plus 2, which means that basically the effect of a same monetary policy stimulus is higher, greater, more powerful when you have precisely a transmission of this in a more equal society. Now, finally, the digital finance issue, the innovation, artificial intelligence, how does this affect markets? Well, we know that you have a lot of good things happening with digital innovation. It's certainly boosting financial inclusion. You can see some of the outcomes of that in terms of more peer-to-peer transactions, business finance, better credit scoring, transactions across borders, cheaper transactions, and so on and so forth. So what is it that can go wrong with artificial intelligence, algorithms, and digital innovation? Well, I think we can think of two scenarios, okay? One scenario, scenario A, is that if this process goes towards a common interoperable platform, tokenization, preservation of data privacy, financial inclusion, all good things, a trust in the system, and just like not too much attention to crypto assets, well, the results is good. It's going to be macro, financial stability, the strengthening of the system, financial inclusion, and so on and so forth. But there is a but. You can have scenario B, a fragmentation of the digital world. You can have geopolitical tensions over reserve currencies. You can have a split in the way countries decide on their payment systems. You can have digital discrimination by algorithms. So then, instead of having the positive effects of digital innovation, you might have fragmentation and a loss of trust in the monetary system itself with, for example, the emergence of crypto assets that pretend to be cryptocurrency. And then you might have higher macro financial volatility. So that's why it is important for central banks to really have a role in becoming a trusted basis for this process of financial digital innovation, and always to making sure that what is implemented for the public good. There is also an important effect that you know with artificial intelligence. This is depicted in the graph on the top left, which is the potential for job displacement, even of high-skill jobs, of medium and high-skill jobs. This is research conducted for the US, but you can have similar numbers for other countries. And therefore, you have a risk of rising unemployment and also of higher costs for our social welfare system, with some negative distributional consequences if this process is not conducted in a way that is smooth and also takes into account the balance of job creation and job destruction. So central banks, Well, they, of course, can benefit from AI and the capacity to better monitor price and financial stability. But one big question for policymakers in the monetary policy realm is, oh, are we going to be replaced by some algorithm, by some AI? Is the art of central banking going to disappear? Because actually, we do things that are very similar. We use models, we use a lot of information, and AI is certainly capable of doing things in a very, very comprehensive way. But there is a difference between the Monetary Policy Committee at the central bank and AI, is that all the decision-making processes is balancing risks under the guidance of human discussion and a fairly sophisticated collegial way with a very well-tested collegial institutional setup, and above all, under the scrutiny and accountability to society and its representatives. So let me finish with now some concluding words about where do we stand with all these challenges for central banks. So I said, look, central banks have done very well to moderate inflation. Well, they had an episode where they didn't do so well, which is the inflation of 21-23. They are working on this. They are facing challenges, the last mile challenge that I mentioned, the financial exuberance, climate change, inequality, and digital innovation. And these challenges, they are difficult because we are still in a situation where inflation is above target. So then the question is, okay, what is needed to really achieve the 2% target, and whether it's going to be needed to maintain high interest rates for a long period of time. And then on top of that, this challenge of the short term is mixed with these features that I described to you as cost push inflationary factors in the medium term. So how do you work in an environment where you are still struggling with current inflation, and you know that at some point in time you will be subject to higher pressure coming from these structural changes? Now, the central banks, they used to work with frameworks that have some reference parameters, and this is what I would try to summarize quickly to you, showing that it's complicated for central banks because some of these parameters are being changed by the new macro financial context of the 21st century. First of all, risk premium. We have, let's say, high debt levels today, as everybody knows, including Japan. The cost of servicing this high debt levels is going to increase because of higher interest rates. We have what is called a rising neutral rate for monetary policy, which is, let's say, simplifying it, the rate where you have a balance between investments and savings, the sort of equilibrium rate for the economy. And because we have less now savings than before, and as I portrayed to you, you have more demand for investment, particularly for the transition and climate change, well, it's likely that this equilibrium rate is going to be going up, not down. You will have possibilities also of financial excesses. I described to you the challenges of cryptocurrencies, of bubbles, and so on and so forth. And finally, also, the way in which you have perhaps a position in the labor market of a level of unemployment that is stable and not inflationary, where people do not demand so much higher wages, where you have a level of unemployment that doesn't accelerate inflation. It's called a neutral rate of unemployment. This also is changing because of what I described to you as this new feature of young people wanted to have different types of work, different work styles, different working hours. So the Bottom line is that for monetary policy, the responses have become indeed much more complicated than before. And what needs to be understood here is that central banks, they face these situations of challenges before. They faced the situation where they had high debts and they were fiscally dominated. They were dominated by a fiscal constraint and also by financial constraints in some cases. So now I think what is important in this particularly challenging moment is for central banks in the future, with all these pressures that I described to you, rising inflation risk, rising neutral rates, higher debt, the demands for the transition to net zero, higher wages, and so on and so forth, is to really be capable of separating what they can do as an institution in charge of monetary policy and what others in society, other agents in society, particularly the government fiscal policy, should do. This is called, in general, the Tinbergen separation principle. Now, two things that central banks can do in their particular domain, which is monetary policy, is to reflect about this 2% inflation target that they had for so many years. Very successful, but now coming under pressure because of the cost factors that I described to you: greening, geopolitical tensions, the transition to net zero, and so on and so forth, higher wages. At some point, somebody, and some central banks are already thinking about it, and this is a reflection that some academics have already engaged, is perhaps to think of a possibility of a higher target for inflation, but not forever, for this period of time that is called the transition. When do you need to think about this? Well, obviously, not while you are still fighting the battle for 2% target. You have to think about this after winning this battle, but you have to be conscious that you will be facing these pressures of successive supply shocks that will increase costs. And for how long do you need perhaps to think of a higher target? Well, perhaps this is difficult to say, but probably during this period of the transition to net zero. It's going to be very important that the communication about this is very clear, is very done adequately. It shows that it's done for a period of time that is well defined, to anchor expectations and to strengthen credibility and to stabilize financial markets. The other thing that many central banks, and I pass on this very quickly, are doing is to have a monetary policy framework that is a bit more comprehensive than the traditional inflation targeting that I mentioned at the beginning. How do they do that? Well, they integrate in the inflation targeting framework more tools, macroprudential tools, foreign exchange interventions, capital flow management. I call this an integrated inflation targeting framework. It's an approach that helps to deal with, at the same time, achieving the inflation target, but also achieving simultaneously financial stability and addressing some of the issues of financial crisis that we witnessed in 2008. Now, of course, it's not only central banks that need to work. There is a number of challenges for governments and fiscal authorities. Governments and fiscal authorities will have to address the issue of fiscal policy that are affecting the work of central banks, because they are the ones responsible for looking at the high levels of debt. They are perhaps looking into ways to think of fiscal consolidation. This is not a central bank business, and it's not by trying to convince central banks to keep very, very low interest rates for a long period of time that these more structural issues are going to be solved. And of course, what you need is to construct, with this dialogue between the fiscal authorities and monetary authorities, a very good policy mix when there is a natural and rational burden sharing between stabilization policies and the discussions about new growth, climate change, clean and sustainable growth. Finally, to conclude, last slide, is it possible to have this balanced policy mix a successful one? Well, I think it is. We have to be optimistic. It's difficult to see how these forces, which you saw are powerful forces for higher costs and at the same time higher demand on social expenditures, can be reconciled. But I think perhaps the best way is to make sure that there is this division of labor between fiscal authorities and monetary authorities, that central banks make clear that their functions have limits. They can, of course, also clarify their mandate. They can even ask or be asked by society to have additional mandates. But even if they are impacted by the issues that I described, central banks alone, they cannot respond to all these issues that I listed. They cannot resolve issues of greening the economy by themselves, rising inequality, lower productivity, and declining growth trends. What they can is to sort of alert society, alert policymakers about what is happening. And ultimately, what is required is the constructions of policy frameworks that reflect these demands for a balanced social contract that encompasses macroeconomic stability, environmental sustainability, fairness, and more equality in our society, with well-defined objectives and instruments. Of course, all this aiming to serve the common good. So I conclude here with a bit of a quote of optimism by the famous philosopher and baseball player Yogi Berra. As you know, it's very tough to make a prediction, especially about the future, but hopefully, it's a phrase of hope, it's not over until it's over. So I think we should wish good luck to ourselves, be conscious of our challenges, and work hard to solve them. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Pereira da Silva, or Luiz, if I may, because it's easier. And you covered a wide range of very difficult issues. And as you said, these are complicated issues. And given that these issues are all complicated, I think you did an excellent job trying to explain these clearly. And now let's turn this over to Professor Aoki Kosuke. And Kosuke can now give us an even clearer picture about what we are talking about. Kosuke.
Okay, thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to make comments on Luiz's talk. And it's a fantastic talk, and it has a lot of insight onto the Japanese economy. And so first of all, for people who are not really familiar with central banking, I'd like to make a brief summary of what central banks are doing. Okay. So typically, a central bank has two objectives. One is stability of prices and economic activities, such as, so what I mean by economic activities are production and employment and so on. Okay. So this framework is called flexible inflation target. So the central bank cares not only about inflation, but they care business cycle fluctuations as well. Okay. So that's the first objective. And the second common objective is price stability. In particular, they want to make sure that the banking sector is healthy and safe. Okay, so those are the two main objectives. And what policy tools central banks have? And roughly speaking, they have 4 policy tools. So first one is nominal interest rate. So we call it the traditional policy tool. So when inflation is high, the bank increases the nominal interest rate. And when the inflation is low, the bank decreases the nominal interest rate, so which we call the conventional monetary policy measures. But sometimes interest rate policy is subject to the zero bound on the nominal interest rate. Therefore, they cannot do enough accommodation. And in that case, they move on to the second one, which is called asset purchases. And it's often called unconventional monetary policy measures. So they buy many kinds of assets. And typically, they buy long-term government bonds. And in the case of the Bank of Japan, they buy equities or ETFs. So that's the second one. And for financial stability, they have two policy tools. So one is liquidity provision. So this is a quite important policy tool during the financial crisis. So the central bank lends money to the financial institutions. So that's the third one. And in normal time, they often they do financial supervision and regulations. So those are the typical policy tools of the central banks. Okay. So challenges Luiz posed during his fantastic lecture. So namely, there are 6 challenges facing central banking society. So inflation, so that's the first one, and financial stability. So those used to be traditional challenges or traditional policy objectives of central bankers. But not only those 2 objectives, the central bankers are facing more challenges for many fields of economics. And third one is climate change. And the fourth one is inequality. And digital financial innovation and artificial intelligence. And when the central banks are dealing with those challenges, they may have to think about their own problem of central bank independence and its mandates and accountability. Okay. Okay, so in order to think about Luiz' fantastic lecture, I think one of the important concepts is the relationship between policy objectives and policy tools, which is called Tinbergen's principle, or sometimes Tinbergen's rule. And Jan Tinbergen is a Dutch economist, and he's a great economist, and he won the Nobel Prize in 1969, and he is one of the 2 first Nobel winners in history. Okay? And here's his principle. And suppose you have multiple economic targets. Let's say we have 5 objectives. Then we need at least one policy for each objective. For example, if you have 5 policy tools. So this means that if you have 5 objectives, you need 5 policy tools. Okay? And another principle is assign a tool which is most effective to achieve that target. For example, if monetary policy is the most effective policy tool to fight against inflation, use monetary policy for inflation. And if it's not effective, then you have to use something else. So that's the third principle. Okay. Okay, so in the light of Tinbergen's rule, so there are several objectives in our society. For example, we have to fight against inflation, and we have to make sure that financial market is stable, and climate change, and inequality, and probably you have to deal with technological innovations such as AI and digital financial innovations. Okay, so then we may have those 5 policy tools. So monetary policy, and financial regulation, and environmental policies, and distribution policies such as taxes and subsidies, and finally, policies for promoting technologies. Okay. And probably the ideal situation is for monetary policy to take care of inflation and financial stabilities. So those are the 2 traditional mandates. And also for financial stability, we use financial regulations. And for the others, for example, for climate change, we may have, well, probably the most efficient policy tool is carbon taxation and regulations. And for inequality, again, probably the most efficient policy tool is taxes and subsidies. For example, you can give subsidies to the poor people, or you can subsidize education, and so on. Okay. And finally, for digital financial innovations, probably we need some technology policies. So that may be an ideal situation, but in practice, the central bankers get involved in many fields of economic problems, not only in their traditional objectives. They may have to take care of climate change and inequality and digital financial innovations as well. And the question is why? Why are they getting involved in so many things, and whether it's ideal or not? And therefore, the question is why central banks? And probably, I think there are 3 reasons for why central bankers get involved in so many things. One is, as Luis emphasized, climate change, inequality, and digital innovations affect their own traditional objectives of price stability and financial stability. And it can affect either directly or indirectly. So what I mean by directly is, for example, bad weather can increase the prices of food and energies. So therefore, it can be a risk to price stability. So what I mean is a source of shocks to inflation and real activities. And the second one, so what I mean by indirectly, is those factors can affect how monetary policy works. So this is called the monetary transmission mechanism. So in order to make sure that monetary policy works efficiently, central bankers need to know how the changes in those factors, climate, inequality, and digital, change their transmission mechanism. So that's the first, and probably that's a good reason. And the second reason, which may or may not be so good, and may be good or not so good, is compared with other policy institutions, central banks can act quickly. So it's an independent policy institution. So therefore, actually compared with politicians who make laws and regulations, it takes much less time to make their important decisions. So therefore, for example, during the financial crisis time, compared with politicians, they can act much more quickly, which is very important in practice to calm down the financial turmoil. So that's the second reason. And the third reason for why central bankers get involved in many things, but maybe because compared with other policy institutions, they have very high research ability. So they hire so many PhD economists and who work on not only on monetary policy issues, but they can work on technology diffusion, or they can work on cyber risks and many fields. So since they have high research ability, they can understand what's going on, and they can come up with some good policy recommendations. And also, Luis talked about the division of labor between central banks and other policy institutions, which I think is quite important and very important. And in the case of Japan, let me remind all of you in the audience, that the BOJ and the government had a very important joint statement back in 2013. Okay? So this is called the joint statement of the government and the Bank of Japan on overcoming deflation and achieving sustainable economic growth. And as some of you may remember, in year 2013, Japan was still under very low inflation or deflation, and the government and the central bank were keen on bringing inflation up. And during this in this statement, roughly speaking, they say that the BOJ aims at price stability, which is 2% inflation target. But this is not the end of the story. And this statement says that the government is responsible for promoting economic growth, such as promoting technological progress and structural transformation of the Japanese economy, such as the labor market reform. And so yeah, as Luis emphasized, central bank is not the only policy institution who deal with economic problems. And that's also the same in the case of Japan. So therefore, in order to assess the performance of the Japanese economy, we have to watch, or we have to check not only what the BOJ has done, but also what the government has or has not done. Okay, so and finally, since this is a fantastic talk, and let me ask Luis some questions about challenges facing Japan. For example, inflation prospect. Well, inflation has been always an issue in Japan. We have now many people think that we have a good chance of achieving price stability of 2%. And whether I want to hear your opinion on this Japanese prospect. So that's the first one. And also in terms of financial stability, many people are aware that equity prices has been risen. And also we have high real estate prices recently. And the question is it sustainable or does it pose any problems in the Japanese economy? And in terms of inequality, probably one of the one of the most cited problems in Japan is the labor market. In particular, some part of income inequality is coming from whether people are in the regular workers or people are non-regular workers. And also, finally, you didn't talk about demography during your talk, but demography is one of the most important issues in Japan, and probably it's also an important issue in many other countries. Okay? And whether this demography, so if it poses some challenges, so then which kind of challenges that demography is giving us? Okay? And finally, in order to tackle those challenges, what do you think is the role of the BOJ? But anyway, so Luis' talk was a fantastic talk, and I quite enjoyed and learned a lot from them. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Kosuke, and thank you, Professor Aoki, for very clear and very good comments. And this has reminded me how good a teacher the Professor Aoki is. So for those of you in the audience who are high school students or maybe freshmen or sophomore of the University of Tokyo, if you come to School of Economics or Department of Economics at the University of Tokyo, you can listen to a clear lecture of Professor Aoki and other professors at our school. So please consider that. Okay, so Professor Aoki or Kosuke gave 5 very big questions to Luis, and we can probably start from there before we take the question from the audience. So can you share the slides again? Sure. There are 5 important questions you mentioned. And while you are sharing the screen again, I'd like to add to the last question he had, what is the role of the BOJ? So you already talked about the BOJ cannot do or the central bank cannot do these by themselves alone. They need to work with other parts of the government or other agencies. And Kosuke also mentioned, it's sometimes questionable if the central bank has to do all of these. And I'd like to throw in one more perspective to this. That is, when the central bank tries to deal with many of these issues, that may undermine the collaborative relation or through division of labor with other policymakers. So, for example, if we talk about climate change, there is a government, there's something the government can do, like carbon taxation and so on. But if central bank can do that and does that or tries to do that, the government may say, well, the central bank can do this, so we don't have to. And we can reduce our efforts. And when it doesn't work, the government can blame the central bank that their effort wasn't enough. It's not our fault as a government. So what do you think of this danger of creating moral hazard, or what we call, or collective action problem within the government or within the policymakers? So I just wanted to add this to the last question Professor Aoki had.
So thank you very much for, first of all, the listening to this dialogue conference, and I will try my best to answer the very important questions that Professor Aoki and Professor Hoshi have put on the table. I think I see, first of all, a process of normalization going on in Japan and positive transformation in general. As you mentioned, I was here about 20 years ago. So at the same time, I see this the process of getting out of what was called a period of difficulties in managing macroeconomic stability, not as in my personal experience as a Latin American entails, which is usually by hyperinflation and excessive stimulus and hyper levels of volatility in the exchange rate. In the case of Japan, it was exactly the puzzle that actually, despite a number of very significant stimulus on the fiscal and monetary front, there was still a difficulty in reaching a 2% inflation target. Now, I think, as far as I can understand, there were significant improvements that took place first, for example, by adopting explicitly in 2013 an inflation targeting regime. And I think more recently, the fact that you have a sort of beginning of a social arrangement, which I understand is taking place with the participation of business partners, with also representatives of workers. I think it's called in Japan the Shunto process, where there is a compatibility with a higher wage level accommodation commensurate with the higher but not so high inflation in Japan currently. So the process is taking place in a sense in the sort of different quarter of policy making than in the US or Europe, where the worry is about having a wage inflation spiral that derails the inflationary pressure and forces the central bank to hike more aggressively policy rates. What I see in Japan is more a process of organized transition from a low inflation regime to a higher inflation regime in a coordinated way. What I also see is that to some extent, perhaps, maybe we can call it a vindication of what happened during many years, where many circles in policy making in other countries couldn't really understand why Japan had so many difficulties in achieving a higher inflation target and higher level of activity. I think the global financial crisis and the aftermath proved that when you get into these situations of low expectations of inflation and a risks of deflation, well, I think many countries in Europe and including the US experienced the difficulties that Japan went through in the last couple of decades. So to some extent, it was not, after all, such an isolated cases. When you get into similar problems of risks of deflation, and liquidity trap, you have to employ these unconventional policies that you pointed out. Now, in terms of the developments in equity markets, my reading is that with this normalization process that is taking place, there is now more buoyancy in terms of equity markets in Japan. I think one of the issues that is being thoroughly discussed is the way in which this normalization process might have a bearing on the exchange rate in Japan. I think this is the topical discussion here, where to find exactly the equilibrium rate that would sort of be consistent with the inflation target, a recovery of activity, and also financial stability, which includes real estate and equity prices. And I think there is, what I hear is some of the balance of risks between a benefit for the usual exporting sectors vis-a-vis the fact that you might have risks of a excessive volatile or perhaps a too much undervalued exchange rate be a factor of contributing to transmission to higher than desirable inflation. On labor markets and inequality, what I sense from other experience in other countries of the world is that Japan has a very special social welfare system. It has preserved a resilience in terms of social relationships across social groups that is perhaps different than other countries. Of course, this is also, I think, related to a process of allowing only limited amounts of immigration in the country. But I think it's also the result of the way in which reforms have been conducted during the phase of the transformations of including more gender participation, female participation in the workforce, and even including some inflows in the service sectors of a limited numbers of migrants. Traditionally, I think there is a large academic literature about the fact that with this social welfare system in Japan, a lot of public goods, the measures of inequality after transfers is favorable in Japan vis-a-vis other OECD countries. And therefore, it allows perhaps the prospects of thinking of structural reforms and the growth strategy in a way that creates perhaps less social tensions than in other advanced economies. For example, I see a view that by using the resilience of the social structures, the social relations that are stable, but also the benefits of innovation in technologies, in robotization, in AI, there is a path towards addressing a level of growth that is that could be based on precisely a combination of greening the economy, which is, I think, a big topic that is that has consensus in Japan, with at the same time innovation in technologies and in the digital world. And I think there is also, at least my very tiny understanding of my short stay here in Japan, prospects for getting significant productivity gains from removing some of the administrative procedures that might be hampering the modernization of business processes and investment processes and so on and so forth. So again, a prospect where even if, of course, I think there is a realization that Japan will have to reflect on the high level of debt, but still with low interest rates, there is a path towards normalizing, achieving a sufficient level of growth that will enable to begin the process of controlling, stabilizing, and then eventually reducing fiscal imbalances in the future. Of course, I think Japan is also very conscious of the aging population issue. I think this is not only in Japan, it's happening, I think, everywhere. But given the level of income that the country has achieved, having a declining population with significant amounts of accumulated assets, and even with some modest growth, is not something that becomes unsustainable, neither from a public finance perspective, nor from a social political perspective. It's probably the issue that will have to be sought and addressed by this skillful combination of how much modernization of health and service sectors can be provided by automation and AI, together with some combination of adapted level of, or a skillfully calculated design level of immigration of specific workforce for these services. Finally, on the complicated questions of the role of the monetary authority, I think, again, what I see is a process of normalization. Japan has been the only central bank in advanced economies that have been now hiking interest rates, even if it is a normalization that is still at the beginning of a process. But it's a signal that, again, the country is moving towards a type of connection between its direction in terms of having a efficient, active monetary policy, like many other advanced economies, having a inflation target, having a labor market wage policy that is consistent with that, having a growth strategy, again, that is supported and advocated by other sectors of the economy. So in a sense, a combination, when you add to that a stable and resilient society in terms of interactions and social relations, is, after all, I think, quite a specific and a unique combination of features. Now, to finish, your last point, Professor Hoshi, about moral hazard and having too many things to do, and then actually taking over issues that other areas of government should be doing. Yes, indeed, this is a pressure, as I mentioned to you, that many central banks clearly have in mind. the response that I've seen is different across the spectrum. Some are very reluctant even to speak about, for example, climate change, because they see this as a way to basically avoid other areas of governments and politicians to just take an approach of delegating it to the central bank, which obviously it cannot be successful. And even if central banks, as I mentioned, have to play a role, but not to be the leading role in this. You have on the opposite side some more active central banks, where even if they are conscious of the moral hazard issue, they believe that because of the impact of climate on inflation and on financial stability, they have to do something. Now, they don't need necessarily to embark upon a massive, for example, green QE program, which would be an extreme version of taking over tasks of other areas of government. But certainly, for example, by discussing in the network that they have created, the network for greening the financial system, by sort of taking into account the sustainability of the financial instruments that they use for the execution of their daily operations, their pension funds, composition of pension funds, and providing information, scenarios, incentives to the private financial sector to take those climate risks into account. They are playing a role that I think recognizes that they should be pushing more other actors, but they also can play their role with responsibility in society in these particular very critical areas where we know, you know, it's a big risk that we are going to be facing in the next few years.
Okay, thank you very much for answering very tough questions from Professor Aoki. Do I have 2 minutes? Okay, well, one question from the audience? Oh, okay. Shannon and Kaori, who are helping us with this webinar, said yes. So let's take one interesting question from the audience, which is about collaboration between Japan and Brazil. What kind of cooperation would you think about? You know, how can Brazil and Japan can coordinate or collaborate in monetary policy, economic cooperation, or economic security collaboration?
Thank you for the question. I think it's a very important way in which Brazil and Japan have historical ties, both in terms of part of the population in Japan is from, for example, I am from Japanese descent. But moreover, I think Brazil is a country that is leading an effort to be a green, sustainable country in this process of transitioning to net zero. So it's doing a number of things in terms of having it has a clean energy matrix. And Japan, on the other hand, has a number of very powerful technological advances and also financial strength. So I think the alliance between what Brazil is capable of doing in terms of investing in a sustainable way in some areas of its agriculture, of a sustainable Amazon project, and the financial strength, and also the interest in Japan in new renewable energy technologies, for me, should be an ideal area for collaboration, as much as, of course, the dialogue between the financial institutions and also the real economy in terms of investments into a country that is itself now perhaps leading example of going towards a strategy for reaching net zero carbon neutrality by 2050.
Okay. Thank you very much. With that, I'd like to close the webinar. I'd like to thank Luiz and Kosuke for very good comments and very good presentation. And I also want to thank Shannon Welch and Kaori Mita, two researchers from the Tokyo College, who helped us, assisted us in the studio to deliver this webinar. And I also thank you, all the audience. Thank you very much. Good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Fantastic.